Thank you, Ambassador Nuland. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I do have concerns that our intelligence sharing is really in name only when it comes to Ukraine. And I know we can't get into the great details here on this, but do you believe our intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians is robust enough for them to protect themselves? Because we get the information from them about the struggle they're having. We know the Canadians are trying to assist them in this, but you know, at the end of the day, they've got to prevail against these Russian-backed rebel forces and Russian forces that are on their territory now with tanks.
Mr. Chairman, in this unclassified setting, let me simply say that our intelligence cooperation with Ukraine, as well as with the Ukrainian intelligence services and armed forces, has been improving over time. There are certain constraints, as you know, but we are continuing to look at what more we can do in a manner that protects our own assets and that we're sure will be used properly.
And let me ask you another question, because I noticed from the head of NATO to the Director of National Intelligence to the new Defense Secretary, it seems like nearly every U.S. official supports providing defensive weapons to the Ukrainians. And indeed, a letter from many members of Congress, including myself, Mr. Engel, the Speaker, will soon go to the President on this subject. Where are we on this decision? Because President Poroshenko continues his appeal to us, obviously.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my testimony, as you know, we have provided $118 million in security and border assistance to date. This is all in the defensive, non-lethal area, but some of it is on the high end of defensive, including the very important counter-fire radar batteries that we were able to provide just over the last few months, which Ukrainians report to us have saved lives, particularly in the most intensive conflicts around Donetsk airports and Debaltseve. With regard to the question of providing more lethal assistance, as my Secretary, Secretary Kerry, testified last week, that question is still under discussion, and the President has not made a decision.
But I want to get back to this issue of Russian tanks that are firing on cities and on Ukrainian positions. If they cannot get precision anti-tank missiles or weapons to use on the ground, there isn't the capability to stop those tanks. And we're not talking about, you know, transferring offensive weaponry like tanks or selling those to Ukraine. What we're talking about are weapons that are purely defensive, but are absolutely necessary if there's going to be any credible deterrence to what the Russians are doing town by town now in the East. The request here, you know, isn't for more blankets or meals, you know, or I saw the inventory of what we've sent them. What they're requesting is quite precise, defensive weaponry that will allow them to hold their positions.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I said, these issues are still under review, including the types of equipment that you note, which would respond directly to some of the Russian supply. Just to state for the record here some of what we are seeing, we have since December seen Russia transfer hundreds of pieces of military equipment to pro-Russian separatists.
Exactly.
Tanks, armored vehicles, rocket systems, heavy artillery.
And part of the point that I'm making is that this is not all being transferred to Russian separatists. There's no way that separatists are in those tanks. They're not the tankers. They're not driving those tanks. Those are Russian soldiers driving those tanks. And I would just make the point, to not decide is to decide.
Understood.
And that's the point we'd make. Lastly, per your observation on the broadcasting, I just wanted to make the point in terms of the dysfunction. Yesterday, it was reported that the new CEO of the agency, Andy Lack, in terms of the BBG, is resigning his post after 6 weeks on the job. Now, we know the problems that staff and others have had over at the BBG. We've heard from our former Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, that the agency is defunct. It's defunct. Myself and Elliot Engel and other members of this committee put a lot of time and effort working with those who have a very real interest in reforming this, getting a consensus. That legislation is necessary to get this agency back up to the business that it did very well, you know, in the 1980s in terms of disseminating information into Russia and into Eastern Europe. That legislation needs to have support from the administration, and I would just leave you with that request, Ambassador.
May I just quickly respond? As you know, as Secretary Kerry said, we do join you in supporting reform of the BBG. We're working with you on that. We have some differences slight with your proposed legislation, but I do want to do a shout out to BBG and its affiliates for the work that they have been doing over the last year to counter Russian propaganda and particularly to support broadcasting in Ukraine. They have devoted $22.6 million to Russian language programming, 104% increase over Maidan spending. They're now, RFERL and VOA have now launched a half-hour new Russian language program, Current Time, which helps fill the gap in clean news. It's being pulled down by broadcasters all across the periphery of Russia, and parts of the Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine are also receiving it, and they are now reaching about 6.6 million viewers. So they have been good partners to us, and our budget request supports doing more together.
We follow that very closely.
Good.
And we also are in consultation with those in theater about the effectiveness. And trust us when we say reforming the BBG is necessary at this time. We have to be able to take some decisive actions to get this back up and running the way it worked effectively in the 1980s. I'm going to go to Mr. Engel of New York, the ranking member of this committee, for his questions. Thank you.